The moving truck pulled up to my driveway on a Tuesday morning. Big, white, engine rumbling like it had somewhere important to be. And standing right next to it were my daughter, my son-in-law, and two men in polo shirts holding clipboards. They looked so organized, so prepared. What they didn't see, what they couldn't have possibly expected, was the police cruiser parked quietly behind the oak tree at the edge of my property, or the second car behind it, or the attorney sitting in the passenger seat with a folder in his lap, a folder I had put together over the past 4 months. My daughter walked up to me with that smile, you know the one, the smile that says, "I'm doing this for your own good," right before they do something that has nothing to do with your good whatsoever. She said, "Mom, the movers are here. It's time." And I looked at her, my own flesh and blood, and I smiled right back. I said, "Yes, sweetheart, it is." Beat. Let the silence breathe. My name is Margaret Ann Calloway. I am 73 years old. I built a life that most people only dream about, and I nearly lost all of it, not to a stranger, not to bad luck, but to the two people I loved most in this world. This is my story. You need to understand what this house means before you can understand what they tried to take. I was born in Dayton, Ohio, the youngest of 5 children. My mother worked double shifts at a textile factory. My father drove a bus 6 days a week. We didn't have much, but we had each other. And my mother always said, "Margaret, a woman who owns her own land owns her own future." I never forgot that. I met Richard Calloway when I was 24 years old. He was building furniture in his garage, trying to turn a passion into a business. I was waitressing, putting myself through night school for accounting. We were broke, in love, and absolutely certain the world owed us nothing, which, looking back, is probably the best attitude two people can have starting out. We got married on a Saturday in June in a courthouse because we couldn't afford a ceremony. We had $12 and a shared dream. Richard's furniture business grew, my accounting practice grew, and 20 years after that courthouse wedding, we bought the estate on Ridgewood Lane. 6 acres, 11 rooms, a pond in the back, and a wraparound porch that Richard built himself with his own hands. We raised 2 children in that house, Diane and my son Thomas. For 28 years, that house was everything. Birthdays, Thanksgivings, Christmas mornings with the kids running down those stairs. Richard's last breath, right there in the master bedroom, the room we'd shared for 40 years. He passed 6 years ago. Heart attack. Quick, they said, which I suppose is a mercy. But there's nothing merciful about waking up alone in a quiet house and realizing that the other half of your life is simply gone. I grieved, I adjusted, and then, because that is what women like me do, I kept going. I was not fragile, I was not confused, I was not in any way, shape, or form ready to be put out to pasture. But my daughter had different ideas. It started about 2 years after Richard died, the phone calls from Diane. At first, they sounded like concern. "Mom, are you eating enough? Mom, the house is so big for one person. Mom, have you thought about what happens if you fall?" I told her I was fine. I walked 2 miles every morning, I cooked my own meals, I was sharper at 71 than most people are at 50, I still managed 4 investment accounts, I served on the board of 2 local charities, and I could beat half the men at my country club at bridge. But Diane had married a man named Gary Perkins 3 years prior, and Gary Perkins had a way of looking at things and people in terms of what they were worth. I noticed it early. The way his eyes traveled around the house whenever they visited. The way he'd ask casual questions. "So, Mom, do you have a financial advisor? Do you have the estate in a trust? What did Richard leave in terms of liquidity?" I always answered vaguely. Richard used to say, "Never show your cards until the game is over." I kept that close. Then the tone of the calls changed. It stopped being, "Are you okay, Mom?" and started being, "Mom, we've been doing some research." Research? Gary's word. Always Gary's word. Diane just delivered the sentences he'd rehearsed for her. "Mom, there are some beautiful senior living communities in Scottsdale, very upscale, the kind of place you'd actually enjoy." I told her I enjoyed my home. "Mom, running a 6-acre estate alone isn't realistic. You have to be practical." I told her I was the most practical person she'd ever met, and I'd been that way long before she came along. "Mom, if something happened to you out there alone, then something would have happened to me in my own home, on my own land, living my own life," I said, "and I'd have no complaints about that." That was the end of that particular conversation, but it wasn't the end of their plan, not by a long shot. They came to visit in October, Diane and Gary. They said it was just a check-in. They brought flowers, yellow tulips, which I've always hated, but that's beside the point. We had dinner. It was polite, surface level. Gary asked about the roof, whether it had been inspected recently. I said yes. He asked about the heating system. I said it had been serviced in August. He nodded slowly, like he was filing things away. After dinner, while I was in the kitchen doing dishes, I heard them walking through the house, not casually, methodically, room to room. I could hear Gary's footsteps stop in certain places: the library, the sitting room, the sunroom Richard built off the back. I dried my hands on the dish towel, and I stood very still, and I listened. And I heard Gary say, in a low voice he thought I couldn't hear, "The property value alone is worth more than we thought. Combined with the investment accounts, we're looking at a significant estate. The attorney said the competency filing is straightforward if we move quickly." Competency filing. I stood there in my kitchen holding that dish towel, and the world went very quiet. Competency filing. That's legal language for trying to have someone declared mentally unfit, which would give them control. Control of me, control of my estate, control of everything Richard and I had built. I walked back into the dining room, set down the dish towel, and said, "More coffee?" And I smiled, because in that moment I made a decision. They would not know that I knew, not yet, and I had work to do. The next morning, I called my attorney, Raymond Stockwell. Raymond had handled Richard's estate and mine for 15 years. I trusted him completely. And more importantly, Raymond was the kind of man who didn't rattle easily. I told him everything I'd heard. There was a long pause on the phone. Then he said, "Margaret, are you sure?" I told him I don't repeat things unless I'm sure. Another pause. Then, "Okay, here's what we're going to do." Over the next 4 months, Raymond and I put together something I like to call the counter portfolio. First, I had the estate's title structure re-examined. Richard and I had never fully updated the ownership documentation after a refinancing we'd done in 2019. Raymond found several technical vulnerabilities that Diane and Gary's attorney could have potentially exploited if they'd moved on a competency filing. We closed every single one of them. Second, I established an irrevocable living trust. Everything, the house, the investment accounts, the land, went into that trust. Diane and Thomas were named as eventual beneficiaries, yes, but the trustee, the person with legal control, was Raymond himself, with explicit provisions stating that I retained full rights to reside in and manage the estate for as long as I chose. Third, I had a formal cognitive evaluation done with Dr. Patricia Nwosu, a neurologist I'd seen for years. She documented that I was in exceptional cognitive health, articulate, organized, high-functioning. That report went into the file. Fourth, and this is where it gets interesting, I had the estate appraised independently because I had a feeling Diane and Gary had already been in contact with real estate agents. I wanted to know exactly what they knew. I was right. An agent named Brennan Holloway had walked the property while I was at a charity luncheon one Thursday in November. Diane had a key she'd copied years earlier without telling me. I found out because Brennan Holloway left a business card wedged in the back door. Probably didn't even realize he'd done it. I picked up that card. I called Raymond. I added it to the file. Then I waited, because I wanted to see how far they'd take it. I needed to see it all the way through. Not just to protect myself, but to understand completely who my daughter had become. January. Cold morning. Diane came alone this time, no Gary. She sat across from me at the kitchen table with a large envelope and the look of someone who'd rehearsed this moment many times, but still wasn't quite sure she'd done enough rehearsals. She said, "Mom, I need to talk to you about something serious." I poured us both tea, sat down, said, "Go ahead." She told me that she and Gary had been speaking with an elder care attorney and also a real estate specialist, and they had genuinely serious concerns about my well-being and my ability to manage the estate long-term. I nodded, listened, didn't interrupt. She slid the envelope across the table. Inside were 2 sets of documents. The first was a petition for guardianship, the competency filing Gary had mentioned. The grounds were vague: declining independent function, isolation, potential financial vulnerability. None of it was true. All of it was paperwork. The second document was a real estate listing agreement. My home, Ridgewood Lane. Already priced, already assigned to an agency. I sat with those papers for a long moment. And Diane said, and I will hear this sentence for the rest of my life. She said, "Mom, it's for your own good. We've already listed the mansion." I looked at my daughter. I thought about the morning I brought her home from the hospital. I thought about teaching her to ride a bike on this driveway. I thought about dancing with her in the kitchen on nights when Richard worked late. I thought about it all. And then I picked up the pen she'd set on the table, and I signed. She let out a breath, relief, I suppose. She said, "Thank you, Mom. I know this is hard, but it's the right." I folded the papers, slid them back in the envelope, and handed it to her. I said, "I'm going to go lie down. I'll walk you out." She hugged me at the door. Her perfume was the same one she'd worn since college. I noticed that. I noticed everything. She drove away. I stood on the porch and watched her taillights until they disappeared. Then I called Raymond. I said, "It's done. Set the date." I'd known the date for 2 weeks. Raymond had known for 3. I'd spent those final days doing exactly what you'd expect a 73-year-old woman to do. Drinking my morning coffee on the porch, tending my garden, reading in the sunroom Richard built. I slept beautifully the night before, the sleep of a woman with a clear conscience. At 8 in the morning, the moving truck arrived. Big, white, engine rumbling. Diane was there with Gary. Gary had the clipboard. He had that energy he always had, efficient, transactional, ready to get things done. And I was standing on my front steps in my good camel coat, the one I wore to Richard's company dinners. Raymond always said I looked formidable in that coat. I saw Diane's eyes flicker to the police cruiser at the edge of the property, then to Raymond's car behind it. She frowned. She walked toward me quickly. She said, "Mom, what's going on?" I said, "Good morning, Diane." Gary stepped forward. "What is this? Why are the police here?" I said, "Gary, I'd recommend you let Raymond speak now. He's the one with the paperwork." Raymond walked up with his folder, calm as you please. In his slow, measured attorney's voice, he explained the following. 1. The documents Diane believed I had signed were not, in fact, the documents she'd placed in front of me. Raymond had prepared 2 sets of papers that morning, the guardianship petition and the listing agreement. I had signed under them, on documents she hadn't looked at closely enough, specifically an eviction notice. Because here is something Diane and Gary had not accounted for. When Gary had Brennan Holloway walk my property back in November, without my permission, using a copied key, they had legally entered a property they did not own for commercial purposes without consent. Raymond had documented it. The police had been informed. And under the terms of my newly established trust, any unauthorized commercial interest in the property by a family member constituted grounds for legal action. 2, the trust. Raymond explained it, all of it, the irrevocable structure, his role as trustee, my full rights, the fact that nothing, not a guardianship filing, not a listing agreement, not any document signed at my kitchen table could transfer ownership of this property without the trustee's explicit approval, which Raymond had not given, which Raymond would not give. 3, the eviction notice. Because Diane and Gary, it turned out, had signed an informal property management agreement the previous spring that Gary had drawn up himself, thinking it would establish their authority over the estate. Raymond used that document against them. It established their presence on the property in a legal capacity, which meant they were subject to removal under a formal notice, which I had now served. Gary went pale, then red, then a kind of gray I've never seen on a human face before. Diane looked at me, just looked at me. She said, barely a whisper, "Mom, what did you do?" And I looked at my daughter, my firstborn, the girl I had loved with every cell in my body for 49 years, and I said, quietly, so only she could hear, "I protected my home, the way your grandmother taught me, the way I tried to teach you." Gary hired an attorney. His attorney called Raymond. Raymond sent him a courtesy copy of the trust documentation, the cognitive evaluation, the unauthorized entry evidence, and a brief note suggesting that if Gary wanted to test any of this in court, Raymond's calendar was wide open. We never heard from Gary's attorney again. Diane and I didn't speak for 4 months. 4 months of silence where I sat with my grief, because that's what it was, grief, for the relationship I thought we had, for the daughter I thought I knew. Thomas, my son, he lives in Seattle and had no part in any of this. When I finally told him the full story, he went quiet for a long time. Then he said, "Mom, I'm so sorry." He flew out the next weekend, we sat on the porch together and watched the sun go down over the pond, and he held my hand, and neither of us needed to say anything else. As for Diane, she came to me in May, alone, no Gary. She knocked on my front door like a visitor, which in some ways she now was. I let her in, I made tea, we sat at the same kitchen table. She didn't make excuses. To her credit, and I will always give her this, she did not make excuses. She said, "Mom, I know you love me. I have never once doubted that you love me. But love does not give anyone the right to decide someone else's story for them. Not a husband's, not a child's, and not yours over mine." She cried. I held her hand. It is a complicated thing, loving someone who hurt you. There is no clean resolution, no ending where everything is repaired perfectly and everyone moves forward unscathed. Real life doesn't work that way. Families don't work that way. But we are trying, slowly, carefully, with an honesty that we probably should have had years ago. Gary is a separate matter that I will leave between Diane and God. I am telling you this story not for sympathy. I don't need sympathy. I need you to listen. If you are a woman of a certain age and the people around you are starting to use words like practical and realistic and for your own good, pay attention. Those words are sometimes love, and sometimes they are something else entirely. Learn to know the difference. Know what you own. Know what your documents say. Know who holds your legal interests and whether they actually hold your interests. Have a Raymond in your life, someone who is on your side, who knows the law, and who will pick up the phone when it matters. And do not, I cannot say this strongly enough, do not let anyone, no matter how much you love them, convince you that being older means being done, that needing fewer people around you means you can't think clearly, that a quiet life is a diminished one. I walk 2 miles every morning. I tend my garden, I sit on the porch Richard built, and I watch the light change over the pond. And some mornings it is so beautiful it makes my chest ache, in the best way possible. I am 73 years old. This is my home. My name is on the trust, my coffee is on the porch, and my roses came up early this year. I am not going anywhere, and neither is this house.